Hi and welcome to episode 231 of Page One, the Writers Podcast. I'm Marco, and thanks for joining us on the podcast where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, find out how they got into the industry and try and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. Regular listeners will be expecting to hear Tarek, but he has had the audacity to go on holiday without recording this intro and outro part of the podcast. So it's just me, but he is in the main interview, you'll be pleased to hear. Or maybe not, I don't know. If this is your first time joining us, please do check out the previous 230 episodes where we've spoken to some amazing authors, screenwriters, comic writers, video game writers, and many more. So please do go and have a look at the back catalogue because there's bound to be someone you are interested in hearing from. This week's guest is both an author and a screenwriter. Jonathan Lee is the creator, lead writer and executive of the recent show The Bombing of Pan Am 103, which obviously revisits the Lockerbie bombing. And we chat to him about how that came about how writing novels differs from writing screenplays. He's written 4 novels before he started to get into the writing for TV and indeed film, as he tells us, and how it is, different working in that sort of collaborative environment compared to the solo world of writing novels. So it's a really interesting chat. So I'll get straight into it after a quick advert for a writer's notebook. But before we do, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. We have recently formed a new writing podcasts network that we're calling Step Podcasts. So as well as the Page One podcast, which includes this one, and the Drafting Notes podcast, you can also hear podcasts from Nadine Matheson, including The Conversation and Coffee Break, and we're hoping to add more shows as well in the future. So you can find that if you look for @State Podcasts on your favourite social media, or find us on YouTube @Step Podcasts as well, where we have our own joint show looking at the latest publishing news as well, Adventures in Publishing Land, which is a fun chat about recent developments in the publishing world that is planned to come out every couple of weeks. The first episode is up now, and you can either watch that in full in video on YouTube, or you can listen to it on your favourite podcast app, and I'll put the links in the podcast description for that. The other thing I wanted to mention was that we do have a Patreon where you can support the podcast, which helps us to continue to get great guests on the podcast and hopefully improve our offering as well. So there's lots of benefits to that. If you check out the Patreon link in the podcast description, you'll see what all the benefits are. But enough from me now. We'll get into the podcast, and then I'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chatting to let you know about next week's guest. As Tarek would say, on with the podcast. The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just the story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page 1.
Did you always want to be a writer?
I did always want to be a writer, I think, for as long as I can remember. I'm not sure I had any sense of what was involved other than grabbing pen and paper, but from an early age, I remember secretly harboring this dirty secret that I wanted to write. Yeah, I was a bit ashamed of it, but it's true.
Well, you went on to study English Lit at uni, but then, am I right in saying you went on to become a solicitor?
I did, that's right. I think like a lot of English Lit graduates, I had a moment of pure panic when I graduated. And I just wasn't sure what I wanted to do or what I was qualified to do. I was keen to write then, and I think I have a university novel that I wrote that was about a young man at university trying to write. It was very clever, and it didn't surprisingly, it didn't spark any interest from anyone. And both my parents had been teachers, school teachers, and like I saw like how hard they worked to that, and I knew I didn't quite have that like patience in me or generosity in me, maybe, even though it's like the most important job ever. So I wasn't really drawn to teaching, and I ended up a flatmate of mine ended up getting dressed up one night in fancy clothes, and she said that she was going to some law firm event. They were coming to Bristol University, and she said there were free drinks and snacks and stuff. So I came along with her, and that's how I ended up being a lawyer for many years.
Yeah, well, we know your pain on that one, because both Tarek and I managed to sort of sidestep out of it, but yeah, Tarek.
Oh, you did. You were involved with law too.
Yeah.
I'm still am, unfortunately.
No, there are good parts of it.
There are good parts of it, yeah.
That's a bit, but yeah.
Is that when you leave at
5 o'clock PM?
Yeah,
finish.
yeah, I was going to say. No, but so you did this. You went into law, I guess, sort of taking the pragmatic route, the sensible route. Were you still writing at that time when you were doing that?
I was on and off. Yeah, I was in this sort of big law firm in London called Freshfields, where the hours were quite unpredictable. So there were, but there were nights where you sort of were there all night doing someone's bidding to try and get, some billable hours up or something for some client. But there were other stretches where you were kind of left to twiddle your thumbs, and it felt like you were like pulling off a heist just by being paid to be there, not working very hard.
Yeah.
So in those moments, I would manage to get a bit of writing done at my desk, and I think it probably taught me, if anything, not to be too precious about writing. I think I'd had this idea that you needed these big chunks of time and silence in certain settings, and I was quite obsessed with that idea. But quite early in my 20s, I figured out, I think, that those things are great, but you sometimes have to just squeeze it in around the edges whenever you can. Yeah.
And your first book that you put out was Who is Mr. Satoshi in 2010, but am I right in saying you kind of written a number of novels before then, but you never kind of either finished them or got anywhere with them? Is that right?
Yeah, certainly one that I finished, the aforementioned genius work, a writer trying to finish a novel, and there were a bunch of other ones, and also a bunch of short stories where I just started. I got a couple chapters in. I just didn't have that momentum. I didn't have the curiosity, the burning curiosity that's needed, that you guys both know, from your own writing, probably, to get through to the end of something.
Yeah.
But I think it wasn't wasted time, at least for me. Like, I think I was figuring out the ways in which I needed to build up my own stamina and patience and curiosity, and before launching into a thing. I think I used to launch in before I really knew what it was, and now I know a tiny bit about what it is before I launch in.
So was apart from the university masterpiece, Was Who is Mr. Satoshi the first one that you managed to finish at that point?
I think it was the first one. I think it was the first one where I realized that most writing is rewriting, and I
Right.
got into the revision process with it. I think it was the first one where I did like multiple drafts of it and honed it. And the lawyer days had, like, one good thing that came out of them was that they took me to Tokyo, and I lived in Tokyo for 6 months,
Okay.
working for the office of the law firm that happened to be out there. And that just like got me fascinated with being in Japan. And while I was there, I started writing about Japan and that kind of and specifically a sort of expat outsider in Tokyo, trying to make sense of the place a little bit and its history. And that became that first published novel.
Right. Okay.
And did you get it up to a state? You know, is that how did you find an agent? I suppose how did it get to be published at that point? Did you review it and rewrite it, as you say, and then start sending it out to people?
I did, and I remember it being, I mean, obviously it wasn't pre-internet, it wasn't pre-internet, but it was that time where you might have like an email address. I think mine was like Smoky Bacon 24. And I'd be like, I wonder why I'm not getting any responses to my job Bacon 24 at hotmail.com. You'd have an email address that you might like check once a week or something like that, you know, and it wasn't, and so there was just like less stuff out there. I remember coming across some GeoCities site, which maybe takes you back,
Yeah.
that had some tips about querying agents. I remember I had one friend of a friend who had published a book, and I remember latching onto her and her being very generous with her time, but like really desperately being like, I have to take this friend of a friend out for coffee and just really like ask her, what are you supposed to do? And, you know, she was good about sort of being like, you know, really work on the first 3 chapters, especially, and think about the cover note and tailor it. And I think around that time I was realizing you could look in the acknowledgement sections at the back of books and that you'd enjoyed and see who the literary agent was who'd been thanked. And so I wrote off to some literary agents of books that I genuinely had liked, and I would start the cover letter with kind of like with a bit of fawning praise, but just being like, I'm writing to you because I really like this book that you represented last year. And I think the first 10 or 12 either didn't hear back or like eventually got back a rejection. But then I got a couple of agents who wanted to see more, and got lucky in that way. Yeah.
And I mean, at this point, obviously, you're still a lawyer and you've got this book out, but you also then shifted away from the law world and moved into the publishing world as a career as well. And I wondered, at what point did you make that transition, and how did working in the publishing sector and writing books, how did that work out? Get both sides of that coin.
Yeah, it was strange. So I think a lot of people start out in publishing and then turn to writing. I kind of did the reverse because based on my first advance, I couldn't afford to kick back with a cocktail and do the whole Norman Mailer thing. So I needed a full-time job still, but I just didn't want to keep going on the law front. And around that time, a job became available at the British Council. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but slightly archaic old empire institution, but sort of an arm of the Foreign Office. And they were looking for a literature advisor, and it was like a job that Graham Greene had done sort of back in the day. And probably funding is dried up since, but there was a team of us working on literature projects, like translation projects that were trying to get like British novelists into translation overseas, but also vice versa. And it was a part-time gig, and I applied for that and got in, and enjoyed that job for a couple of years. And then that led into I ended up moving to New York, ended up moving here from London. I got to a stage where like no sort of literary magazines or publishers would really hire me in the US, but I did what I think you guys have mentioned you did it when you were starting to break into the writing world, which is I sort of volunteered to interview people and like got just any excuse to meet people,
Yeah.
basically. Talk to
Yeah.
them. And eventually a kind of literary magazine editing job came out of that, and I started to do some work for the Paris Review and A Public Space and some other literary journals that now sadly are like all having their funding pulled by the Trump administration. And then that led into book publishing, and I was an editor at Bloomsbury for a while and other places, and ended up being the editorial director at Bloomsbury. And then a few years ago, when some of my screenwriting took off, I sort of left that job and finally kind of got to write full time, which is something I'd been kind of knocking on the door of for about 20 years by that point.
And what did editing teach you, if anything, about your own writing?
It definitely taught me the value of economy, I think, in terms of obviously one of the great things about writing novels is that there can be flights of fancy. In screenwriting, economy is much, everything's so compressed. You're always looking to jam in little nuggets of information and things into the smallest possible scenes. But I think as an editor, sitting in these meetings every week where we're all receiving hundreds of novels each week, and that you can't do them all justice. You really end up in these meetings talking about the first pages of books, and it can be perhaps paralyzing sometimes to think about the importance of a first page or a first couple of pages. But it really made me think about that. It really made me ask, like, why start the story here? How am I going to draw the reader in? And that doesn't necessarily mean dead body mystery in sentence one. Just thinking about voice and wit and like just creating an atmosphere in as short as time as possible, a few lines as possible, that people want to hang out in for a minute.
Yeah. And you said with your own writing, you mentioned earlier that and now you like to at least have some sort of idea about where you're going. But I think you have said that you are a bit, I think the term was aimless when you start something. Is that still the case?
It is. I mean, it differs project to project. There's some screenwriting projects I do where, like a producer will hire me and wants to go through a process of like a beat sheet in a quite detailed structure and try and get everything down as soon as possible before doing what I think of as real writing. But when left to my own devices, I do like to start before I've thought everything through. Like, I do like to be a bit aimless because it's part of my way of building up my own excitement, I think. I don't know about you guys, but I need to have some freedom in order to feel I'm free on the page. And so if everything's pre-decided, then that's a tough thing for me. I'm like less excited to just open the document up and get stuck in.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I feel similar to that in that it's the discovery of what the book's about as I get going is part of what's the fun part of it for me, and sometimes I'll have like a kind of nugget of what I want, of what it's about or something, but I'll maybe take 10, 15,000 words before I'm like, okay, actually this is what the book's about. These are the themes I want to explore, blah blah, and then it kind of takes off and it gets really exciting. But until then, I'm never quite sure with it.
Yeah, I do prefer to have more of an idea, I guess, about where I'm going with the story. But even then, sometimes that can be its own downfall as well, because you can get to a point where you think something was going to happen and it isn't happening the way you thought, and it can sort of hamstring you that way as well. So, I think everyone obviously has their own ways to try and get through these things. But it's interesting that I think what we've learned from speaking to so many guests is that, some people call themselves pantsers, some people planners or whatever, but really we're all trying to work through that same process and discover it as we write it, really, I think.
I think that's right. I think that something you just said then sparked something for me too, where I think sometimes the fact that you've set something on a page kind of weds you to it. And I saw that a lot as an editor as well, but people just wouldn't be able to let go of the idea, and I do this myself all the time, that this is how it opens because this is how you've already opened it. Or this is the key turning point or whatever. And sometimes you just need to almost open up a fresh page, I think, and like try out some other things without feeling like you're destroying what you've already made.
I find that personally very, very difficult, actually, is in the redrafting process, if I'm thinking, right, I have to change this point, this has to change, it's very difficult for me to forget what I've already written. You
want to just work around the text you've got there and
exactly,
shape it a little bit differently rather than scrubbing it all and doing it from scratch.
Totally. I think that's part of the importance of outside readers as well, ideally before you submit things to agents and editors, isn't it? Because there are points where your spouse or family member or friend or whatever will be like, I just couldn't make any sense of why this happens after this, and in your head there's this other chapter that you once wrote that's the connective explains everything.
Exactly.
but that was cut like 10 drafts ago, and in your mind the connective tissue is still there, I think.
I wondered if you're starting a novel from a kind of a nameless place, I suppose, where you're like, I kind of have a rough idea, but I need to do some exploratory writing to work out what the book's about. How does that marry up when you pitch an idea to a publisher and say, here's my idea for book 3 or 4, and they say, that sounds great, and then you kind of go off and then you're like, oh, actually it's kind of become a different thing now, but this is what I want to write. Have you had any problems with that, or has it always been, that's fine?
I have, I've never really I suppose I've tended not to be sort of pitching books in advance too much in the way that you might do with non-fiction or certain types of genre fiction. But I have had a situation where I've had like a 2-book deal, and I've had to give like a page of like what the next novel will be, and then 4 years later when you come around to trying to finish that novel, is completely different. And I've come to the conclusion that basically if it's good, no one cares, and if it's not good, you're in trouble. But I think it's one of the weird things, isn't it, about novel writing as opposed to screenwriting and lots of nonfiction, is that you don't get a lot of feedback until you've really done the bulk. So you're just kind of in the dark, in a room on your own. My daughter the other day, like, apparently she was asked at school what her parents do, and she described how like her mum has a real job, and dad sits alone a lot in the garage working away, doing something on his computer, and the teacher was like, oh, he must do other things as well, and she was like, yeah, sometimes he goes out in the garden and he picks up dog shit. So she was thinking it through. I think she used the word poop.
That's the life of a writer right there.
That sounds amazing.
It's a good mix of things.
But actually, just staying on that point, I guess, because you have moved into the world of screenwriting, and certainly what I understand screenwriting to be, and from other screenwriters we've had on, you always hear about like treatments and things like that are getting presented, and obviously you are getting much more feedback. But do you have to pitch these ideas more? Do you have to be more prepared with that story before you go forward with the screenplay?
You really do, and it almost, in these pitch meetings, it almost feels like a job interview, where I always felt like in a job interview that it hadn't gone well unless you like felt you'd humiliated yourself a little bit. Like there's a bit of a sense of like you just have to like come up with the slightly fake version of what the slightly overblown version of a thing is in order to try and bring people on board. Like you can't really be like, well, really it's going to be this subtle character story about this group of people or this town or whatever. You sort of have to be a slightly more bombastic, with it. So it feels like a different art form. It feels like almost like I've never done copywriting, but it feels almost like an advertising type of writing in order to try and get the project going. Because that's the thing about screenwriting. It's like with a novel, you really can obviously just get started if you have the privilege of a bit of time and space. But with screenwriting, there's so many things just to get to base camp. You're just out in the road for days, just like trying to hitch a ride to base camp, and then when you're there, you're like trying to make sure you got all the kit, and then you're just trying to edge up the mountain to get anywhere close to a stage where you could get anything made.
Yeah.
And it's a different process. Yeah, and you have to kind of con your way up a little bit at each stage.
I got plenty of oxygen. It's fine.
Yes. Yeah, don't worry. I've got a backpack full of ideas over there.
Yeah. Well, let's chat about your latest work then, because it's a TV show, The Bombing of Pan Am 103. Why don't you tell us what it's about and maybe how it came about?
Yeah, well, it's another very clever title. It's called The Bombing of Pan Am 103, and it's about the bombing of Pan Am in 1988. And it's a story that came to me really after I'd been working on this novel High Dive, and I published that, and that was about an attempted assassination on Margaret Thatcher in 1984. The Brighton bomb, as it's sometimes referred to. And I just got sort of really interested in geopolitics in that period in the 80s, and also that sort of investigation of a bombing, like thinking about how a bomb blasts everything apart, and I think it just perhaps appeals to me is the wrong phrase, but as a storyteller, there's something I think in that idea of like splintering narratives, like the thing that was whole becoming different parts, thinking about different perspectives on an event. Almost like that amazing visual artwork and Exploded View. I always forget the name of the artist, but where she kind of blew up a shed and then just like as it was.
Yeah.
You're sort of not recreating the event or the thing as it really was, but you're sort of doing your version of it, I suppose, and like trying to shine a light on certain parts of it. And Eric Roth, great screenwriter who wrote, Forrest Gump and A Star Is Born and Munich and all sorts of other stuff, had read that novel I wrote about the Margaret Thatcher attempted assassination, and he liked that, and that got me into screenwriting. I worked on a script with him, and then I think some producers at MGM had read that script at some point, and they had optioned some material. It was kind of interviews with lots of Scottish detectives done by Adam Moraine Griffiths, an amazing producer on the show. And they wanted to build out a show about the Lockerbie bombing, trying to capture some of the complexity of that event. So I think there was a sort of sense in which the MGM guys were like, this guy can write about 80s bombings.
Get us the 80s bombing guy.
The Rolodex.
Yeah, a mixed reputation to have. But I was really interested in that period, and like for me, sort of Lockerbie, I'm sure you guys haven't even perhaps a closer connection to it. But I remember that being one of the first events I saw kind of unfolding on TV, living in England. And for our director, Michael Keeler, and my co-writer, Gillian Roger Park, they were even closer to it, being Scottish. And it was just such a fascinating event. And I thought I knew about it. But really, once I peeled back the curtain a bit and started to read all these interviews and meet like the real FBI agent involved and some of the real detectives, it just became such a fascinating story to me and such a portrait of that time. Yeah.
And when you're doing stuff like this that's based on real crimes, real bombings or whatever, do you have to be cautious about how you approach that, and also I suppose treat those, for example, those interviews that you had and stuff, with some caution, with so that you're not being led down a path to tell a certain type of story, but you're telling the story that you want to tell about it?
Yeah, it's a tricky balance to find, I think, and it's, but speaking to the more people you speak to, the more sense you get that everyone remembered everything differently, and that you are just telling one version of events, even if it's from multiple perspectives. But at the same time, I suppose what was important to us was there are certain investigative facts that remain consistent throughout if you really dig into it. And we live in a time when sometimes those facts aren't sort of valued or held up to the light, as we know, in different ways. And so at the same time as sort of not trying to tell the whole story in a 6-hour show for the BBC and Netflix, we did want to be absolutely sure of our facts when it came to kind of important investigative facts, and that was important to the families too. And a lot of this stuff has been shrouded in conspiracy theories for decades, some of which are still going on. So that was important.
We've spoken to authors that have written historical novels based on real events, but normally those are much further in the past. So I suppose you have more leeway with that type of story. You'll still get angry readers writing in if you get something wrong, but there's less source material, I guess, and more scope to put a slant on the story. But with stuff that is still, as you say, I remember the TV report, the news when the Lockerbie bombing happened, and I've got family in Dumfries, so very close to Lockerbie, so it sort of always has stuck with me. But there must be a sense of responsibility that you want to get this right, and you want to show it as accurately as possible, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of the special responsibility that comes with that stuff is like checking with people that they do actually want this thing to be remembered. And I think, in the early going, when we go to memorial events in Scotland, in DC, in Syracuse, often the sense that comes across from those who've lost the most is that there is a desire to sort of keep the memories alive and make sure they survive, and to not forget what happened, and not forget the kinds of mistakes that could lead to another Lockerbie kind of happening again. And I think, like, ultimately it's not so much like the tragedies themselves that kind of appeal to me when I'm writing a series like that, or a novel like High Dive. I think it's more about like the little stories, the contrasting sense of scale, like the little human acts of resilience and survival that Wikipedia doesn't record, that come at those events.
It sounds almost like the focus is different. I'm thinking of stuff like Dahmer, or a lot of the true crime stuff that's been made recently, where you've kind of got the drama about a murderer and his victims and stuff, but the focus is often, I think, on the murderer themselves, and it,
almost
glamorizing, but kind of sensationalism, I suppose, and this feels like a very different. I suppose a bombing is maybe a different beast, because you're not really. It's an event that is the focal point, as opposed to a single person doing multiple crimes. But it feels like the focus of this is more the kind of fallout of it, and people who were affected, etc., rather than the actual person doing the crime. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that is fair to say. I mean, I always thought United 93 was an amazing film, for example. I think there's it's not that sort of any perspective on these events is wrong. It's just that you have to pick your perspective and stick to it. Now, there were definitely ways, in the same with any book, I think, too. There were definitely conversations along the way with various people who would suggest, like, maybe we should be cutting often to the Libyan bomb maker and sort of digging into it. And sometimes, there were elements of sort of genre detective storytelling that we embraced. There were others we tried to subvert a little bit in our own way, like whether it's just like not having one lead detective with a very neat sort of frequently flashback past that fits some trauma that connects to the current event. but a lot of that stuff, like of kind of like cutting to the killers in a sort of dark and like haunting music sort of way, just felt like it was not right for what we were trying to do, I guess.
Yeah.
And you're, I think I'm right in saying you're the showrunner as well. Do you want to, it's a term that gets that people will hear, but what does that actually, what is the day-to-day of that?
It's a strange word, isn't it? And in a way, like not really an official title, but as the creator of the show, and the lead writer on it, is kind of you end up being involved with all sides of the production, even if it's the director, in our case, like the wonderful Michael Keeler, who is there every day on set. But I got to be on set at different intervals, got to sort of be involved a little bit in thinking about the design and the music. And for example, Michael and I talked early on about our mutual love of the band Mogwai, who I went to see up here in New York a few weeks ago at Brooklyn Steel. They played, and I remember Michael texted me and he was like, "Make sure you've got your earplugs." And I was like, "I need earplugs." And that's why I can barely hear you today later. But we sort of agreed that Mogwai would be the perfect sort of Glasgow band to do an original score, for example. And so you get involved with all those things that you have so many tools at your disposal that you don't necessarily have as a novelist, right? Thinking about the music, thinking about the visuals, thinking about all that stuff. But then there was also a steep learning curve in that there were scenes that I wrote where we'd get to set at like 6 a.m. On a pretty cold Glasgow morning, and there'd be like a fire engine there hosing down buildings, and you realize like some of the people are there on set just to supervise this thing, and I'd have to turn to someone and be like, "Well, remind me why I don't remember there being a fire engine in this scene," and they explain, "Oh, it's because you wrote that it had been raining the night before," and like those things you wouldn't really think about in a novel because there are no consequences.
Yep.
My dog is woke up. But they suddenly, the scripts having been literary documents to some extent to get people excited about making this thing, and they become a very practical thing. And on the day.
And how do you compare in terms of what you prefer? Writing your own novels and you kind of in your own head and in your own space in the garage picking up dog poo, or do you quite like writing for TV in this kind of collegiate environment where you're working with other writers?
Yeah, it has its pluses and minuses, but I do at the moment I get very excited by the TV and film projects, and I think it's partly just a practical thing of like having young kids, like having a lot going on, and just liking being able to work on a few different things at the same time. Mm-hmm. Whereas for me, when I'm in a novel, it's pretty all consuming, at least on the creative side of my life. Yep. And sometimes, as the going can feel pretty slow, and there's something quite nice with the script about being able to do a pass on it within a couple of days and sort of there's more of a sense of momentum, and there is more talking to people too, although that can go both ways depending on who you're working with. But it was exciting to get to work with like a great director like Michael. I'm working on another thing at the moment with the MGM producers, who are great. That's a sort of Hitchcock film that we're trying to do as a TV series, and it's great to be able to play around in, as the Americans would say, in those different sandboxes, sand pits. So it's fun being able to do more than one thing at once, I guess.
Nice. And is because often what we hear is the trouble with writing scripts, especially in America and stuff, is that you're going to get back notes, and you get back notes from a billion different type of people, and so one note is telling you one thing, one note is telling you the other, and you have to, as the writer, try and balance all of these things. Can it be as bad as that, or does it just depend on the project?
Yeah, I think it depends on your attitude when you go into it. I think if you go into it thinking it's going to be like a novel where it's really your thing, and maybe eventually one or two other people will give you feedback. If you go in thinking that way, it can be, it can be a bruising process for sure. I think if you go into it more in the sense that like this is a group undertaking, and that your job is not just to steer the ship on the page, but to try and reflect as best you can the different things that the different people involved are interested in, the things that drew them in. It becomes a bit more of a team sport. No one likes getting loads of notes, but I have learned that it's worth sleeping on them and thinking about, and then letting them filter through. And like, it's a bit of a cliche, I suppose, but trying to figure out the note behind the note, because
Yeah.
there isn't really such a thing as a bad note. There can be like a poorly expressed one, but assuming someone has actually read the script, what they're saying reflects something they bumped on.
Yeah.
And so you want to think about what that thing is.
I wanted to switch switch tracks a little bit and ask about something I read you'd said in an interview, which was about the importance of the rhythm of words. I suppose maybe applies more to novel writing than TV writing, but we've certainly talked on the podcast before about the importance of reading your work out loud to kind of hear how the words and the sentences sound. And I think in the same interview you said that you often record yourself reading it out and you play it back. And I wondered what is it that you listen for when you hear your work being read out, and what are you trying to improve with that?
It's better than the rhythm of the barking in the background. I am always trying to hear. Increasingly, I'm trying to hear if there's a clarity to these things, to the barking, for example. I'm trying to hear if it's completely self-serving and a little bit sort of like up itself. I'm trying to, but I'm trying to see if there's I feel like an editor will often, for example, say, "Oh, this character's name in a script or a novel is a bit similar to this character's name, so let's change out the names." And I don't know about you guys, but whenever that happens to me, I spend forever thinking about what the next name will be, because I don't think to anyone outside it would matter how many syllables the new name was compared to the last one. But to me, it seems like if the new name is going to be a different amount of syllables than the previous name, every sentence involving that name needs to change. And I'm not sure it really matters as much as I think it does, but looking for some kind of musicality in the sentences seems important to me, and just also variation. Like sometimes a note that I do think is sometimes confusing to me is the great note about tone, where someone's looking for consistency tone. Like, does this really fit in with the tone? And I always find that a bit strange, because I'm not sure that one tone is what anyone should be going for. I think there's it's about, isn't it, trying to play with as many different colors on the palette as you can, and picking a moment for each.
I mean, when I do things like that, sort of read it aloud or something like that, I suppose I don't even really know what it is that I'm looking for. It's like that. This is a legal quote. Was it? I can't remember who it was. It was one of the House of Lords judges, but it was about pornography, and he says, or what's obscene or something, and he said, "You know it when you see it." So it's it's similar when I read stuff out. It's not necessarily a specific thing that I'm looking for, but you can tell if a sentence is clunky or if something isn't quite working in a way that doesn't always come across when you just read it on the screen or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I still will print things out as well for the same reason, in that I think that gives you a different perspective too. Like, I think the way you read a thing on the screen compared to how you read it on the page. I think even changing the typeface sometimes can help. I remember meeting a New Yorker editor who said that if they're really sort of close to saying yes to a story that's been submitted to them, this particular editor will put the story into the New Yorker font and just see how it feels in the right typeface.
Yeah.
And I think there's something, it sounds crazy, but I think there's something in that, like seeing things in as many different forms as you can, because we all become so blind to certain quirks. You know, I remember once an editor saying to me, like, do you know that you used the word freighted 20 times in this novel? And I didn't, you know, the word freighted was not front and center of my mind. I probably had never used it out loud, but somehow it had like slipped in there. I also had my first agent used to write BP in the margin of certain things that I'd written, and she explained that it stood for baby pictures, as in these are things that you want to see but no one else wants to see. It's your baby, but no one else cares. You know, you needed to write it, but no one else needs to read it. And I think about that a lot too.
Okay. And something else you said, which I found really interesting, was you were talking about historical novels and detective novels, and I guess these kind of genre works, and that people look at these books of these certain genres and assume that the book can't also be a work of art or a piece of art. And I wondered, you know, is that still the case, you think, now? And do most authors have to choose from the outset whether they want their book to be commercially successful or a kind of like a piece of art, or can it be both?
I definitely think anything can be both. I think we like to convince ourselves that there's a certain type of literary writing that's somehow divorced from genre, but the categories that publishers use don't really make any sense, do they?
No.
It's, you know, literary work can cross the spectrum, and you know, you read a Le Carre novel, for example. Sure, you can call it a spy novel, but it's also going to be written with more panache than most novels you read. I think there's a certain type of literary writing that I find myself pushing back against more and more, probably, even though I perhaps used to write more of it. But the long passages that kind of describe the dew on at the end of a leaf, kind of like, you know, dripping onto the grass or whatever. All of that can be beautiful, but I do think sometimes it's a way of hiding from having to write things where stuff actually happens, you know, and that thing can be, the thing happening can be a tense moment in a scene where you're not sure if coffee is going to get spilled on a table or not. It doesn't have to be world-shattering Tom Cruise style stakes. But the sense that building a sense of tension and a sense of unease, if that's what you're going for, or comedy or whatever it might be, like those things are hard. And I think sometimes art can be a word that's used to sort of like shun away from the difficulty of actually doing some of that so-called genre nuts and bolts stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm very sort of anti snobbishness, I guess, which is what it can be. You know, there's definitely certain genre or whatever that look down on others.
Sci-fi stuff, I feel
it's not as worthy because it's a story that, as you say, Tarek, it's a story that's got elves in it, so it can't possibly be a work of art or something.
Right,
and
then you read, like, if you read Lord of the Rings or you read Kazuya Shigeru or whatever, you're like, oh, I'm present
exactly
master here.
Yeah, exactly. So Bombing of Pan Am 103 is out, but what I realise you may not be able to tell us exactly what you're working on, but what is next in the pipeline?
I am working. I mentioned like Harry, and I am working on a spy thing with A24.
Cool. Wow.
Right. So yeah, just and it's sort of a little different. It's a spy show set in the world of books. Strangely.
Oh, that sounds cool.
that's fun. There's also the Hitchcock thing I mentioned.
Can you tell us which Hitchcock film it is that you're
I
adapting?
don't think I'm allowed to
Fair enough.
mention it yet, but it's one of my favorite Hitchcock films.
Blink once if it's Psycho.
The camera
This doesn't work because the
quality
camera's frozen.
Yeah.
I should have picked a visual cue.
There is a shower over there, but can't hear the horrible music. Yeah, so that's a really fun thing. What else have I got going on? I'm also working on I was just going to say I'm just also working on a sort of state of the nation political thriller thing.
Oh, cool.
Oh, cool.
That's cool. I just was going to ask, obviously you have moved into this world of screenwriting now. I mean, does that mean you've moved away from books, or is it something that you would want to go back to at some point?
Yeah, I hope I haven't moved away from books. I feel like right now there's a lot of opportunities, which is a rare thing, in the screenwriting world. So I'm trying to capitalize on them and kind of keep things going. But I very much hope that I haven't written my last book. I'm quite eager to get back to. I've got sort of half a novel that's, on the back burner, and I'm a little bit scared to look at it and see if it still holds up.
We've all got those. What was the last book that you read?
The last book I read, I think, was called Beautyland. It's a novel by Marie-Helene Bertino, who's a great story writer and novelist in the New York area. If you haven't read her stuff, and it's kind of a strange book in a wonderful way. It's about this girl who sort of realizes she's different. She possesses this knowledge of a faraway planet, talking about kind of interesting playing with genre stuff. And the arrival of this fax machine enables her to contact her extraterrestrial relatives. And it's a very funny, beautifully written, strange sort of fable. And it's very different to anything I've read in a while. So I would recommend
Sounds
that.
good.
Yeah.
What about the last film that you watched?
The last film I watched, I think, was Soderbergh's Black Bag. Have you seen that one?
Oh no,
I've not seen it. I've heard good things. But
Kate Blanchett.
Yeah, it's very
Nicole singing.
expertly sort of tight, sort of spy thriller. It's really lean. It's really sort of down to the bone, and it's got some great twists and turns. And I think it was a rare film where I could have done with like an extra half hour. To get to know the characters even better. But when you've got people like Kate Blanchett and Michael Fassbender playing the roles, like it works pretty well. They're amazing performers.
Soderbergh's nuts. He seems to put out like 6 films a year or something these days. He's so efficient, and maybe to the point of too efficient. I don't know if he's maybe leaving too much behind, but his output at the moment from having. Do you not see he was retiring about 6 years ago, and he seems to have done more work now since then.
I love the fact that I'm a big fan of his stuff, and I love the fact that he is always trying out different things. Like I think he put out a TV show last year that was just on his website. Like they just they did it kind of guerrilla style, and that's the way it is. And he's always dabbling in different areas of culture, and actually talking about recommendations. If you've never checked out his annual list of things that he's read and watched and listened to,
cool.
Yeah,
okay.
It's just an incredible insight into his mind and his tastes, because you always find some stuff on there that you've never heard of in your life. Nice.
No, I do love his stuff. I'm not the one film I really want to see from his that I've not seen yet is, I can't remember what it's called, but it's the haunted house, but it's shot from the point of view of the ghost.
I haven't seen it yet. Yeah,
it sounds very cool.
Excellent. And what about TV? What are you watching on TV at the moment?
TV, I've been watching The Studio. Have you heard
brilliant.
Of
yeah,
I've not watched that yet. Yeah,
it's so good.
Is it on Apple TV over in the UK?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's Seth Rogen comedy about Hollywood. I'm sometimes suspicious of that advice, sort of write what you know, but sometimes it feels like you should write what you want to know about. You should know from the end, but you should follow your curiosity. But in this case, you can tell he just knows the world inside out, and he really captures the sense of well-meant chaos that plagues most creative industries.
It's the funniest show that I've seen for a while. It's so well
Good.
done.
Oh, great energy. Yeah.
And Tarek, what the last
yeah, so the very, very final thing we always do is a super quick fire either or, and there's no right answer to any of these really, apart from the last one perhaps. But let's begin with writing books or writing TV shows.
For the moment, writing TV shows.
Yeah.
TV or cinema?
I think TV can be cinematic. I think I'm getting more and more interested in writing a feature film for the first time. So.
Okay, cool.
Nice. Night owl or early bird?
Early bird.
Music or no music when you're writing?
No music.
And the last one, paper book or ebook?
Oh, definitely paperback.
Literally nobody ever picks ebook. It's bizarre.
I will say in defense of ebooks that there are certain types of books, especially for research, where it's just incredibly efficient. I can use the iPad, but if it's anything for pleasure, I do prefer. Afraid I'm in the camera.
I mean, he's got a big bookshelf behind him. Tarek.
I know that was stupid. I should have changed that question.
I see it is back to back. I hardly ever see anyone like on the subway or whatever. I hardly ever see anyone reading on a Kindle or anything now. I mean, sometimes.
To be fair, that's a good point. Actually, most times I see people reading out and about. It is in a paper book. Actually, a lot of idiots out there. I would say. A lot of mugs.
I don't know, how do you counter this, Tarek? But I find unless I'm putting a physical book down and seeing the cover around, I can never even remember the fucking title of the thing.
Yeah, I know what you mean. There's something about I know the seeing the cover. I mean, I'll be honest. I take on this persona as an ebook champion. I actually. Maybe do. I do tend to be more.
This is recording, Tarek. Say this.
Oh, I love ebooks. Paper books are the devil's work. Yeah. But I feel like someone has to fight their corner.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Jonathan. That was great.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks very much to Jonathan for coming on. I really enjoyed that chat, and I always find it fascinating hearing about the, working in that world of screenwriting, because it is such a different world, I think, from writing novels, where obviously if you're being trad published, you do work with editors and stuff, but it's a different world entirely to, working with everyone involved in a TV show or a film, where you're having to, I guess, please many masters. But as he says, maybe the best thing to do is, go into it with your eyes open. And if you're expecting that, then perhaps when you're getting, I don't know, hundreds of notes on your latest script, it's not quite as bad as it first appears. Obviously, you can watch The Bombing of Pan Am 103 now. I'll put a link in the podcast description to that. And I'll also put a link so you can pick up Jonathan's books as well. I should say as well that on the Patreon, we have a bonus bit for our Patreon subscribers where our weekly guest stays around for a little bit to tell us about 5 books that have influenced them as a writer. And we do have that with Jonathan as well. So you can watch that or listen to that on our Patreon if you sign up for that as well. This is a 2-episode week of Page One, the Writers Podcast. So in just a few short days, you'll be able to hear our next episode, which is with the brilliant Amelia Blackwell, whose debut adult novel, A Crime Through Time, is a sort of meta sci-fi book involving Jane Austen and time travel and jumping into the set of a Jane Austen book being made. It's all a very clever and quite funny premise. So please do tune in for that chat, because it's another fun chat. I've put all the links, I've mentioned all our links and stuff, so you can check out all our extra bits in the podcast description. If you enjoyed today's episode, please do take the time to rate and review us, as that helps us to continue to get great guests on the podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube or listening on YouTube as well, leave a comment and we'll be happy to respond. Or if you want to get in touch with us, you can get in touch with us on most social media at UK Page One or at Step Podcasts now as well. And you can also drop us an email at podcast@rightgear.co.uk or indeed at podcast@steppodcasts.com. But that's enough from me, and we will see you in a few short days for the next episode.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, be sure to hit that thumbs up button and hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode like these ones down here.
And if you want to get in touch, you can do so by finding us on our social media platforms up here, or drop us a comment way down below there.
But otherwise, thanks for listening and join us for the next episode.
See you later.